Welcome to plenary session number 3, titled European Security Challenges. We have 3 speakers for this particular session. On my right is His Excellency Mr. Konstantinos Kollias, Ambassador of the Hellenic Republic to Cyprus. On my left, Øyvind Svendsen, I hope I pronounce your name correctly, Senior Researcher, Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, and last but definitely not least, Madam Jessica Larsen, Senior Researcher, Danish Institute for International Studies. Before I give the word to Mr. Ambassador, a small favor, please. Let's be punctual about our time, 15 minutes maximum for each speaker. Please, it's a personal favor. Mr. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation to participate in the Cypriot Pre-Presidency Conference organized by the Cyprus Center for European and International Affairs and the TEPSA. I would like to thank the organizer for the opportunity they offered to us for a fruitful exchange of views on issues concerning Europe and our future. Definitely, we live in a constantly changing geopolitical environment. Regional conflicts, aggressive rhetoric, social challenges, hybrid threats form a web of adversities that jeopardize the strong foundations of our Union. In this fragile situation, it is clearer than ever that as European partners, we must act collectively and in a coordinated manner based on the common principles and values that unite us all. The ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine has demonstrated clearly, in the harshest possible way, that peace on our continent cannot be taken for granted. This war not only represents a blatant violation of the UN Charter and of international law, of course, but also remains a serious threat to European security and global stability. At the European level, our level, from the very first moment, we made clear that changing borders by the threat of use of armed force cannot be accepted either in Ukraine or anywhere else. It is essential to continue our unwavering support to Ukraine, but also to demonstrate that armed force cannot be accepted anywhere else. It is essential to continue our support. In this vein, it is of utmost importance that the European Union should be involved in any peace agreement, in any peace arrangement, and make sure that necessary guarantees are in place to deter the recurrence of such a tragedy in the future. Greece, as a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council, has demonstrated in practice its commitment to keep the issue of Ukraine at the top of the UN agenda, notably when it comes to reconstruction efforts. My Prime Minister, Mitsotakis, addressing the Ukraine Recovery Conference last summer, expressed Greece's readiness to support the recovery of Ukraine, and especially the city of Odessa, a city which has deep historical ties with my country. At the same time, we should uphold Ukraine's efforts to join the EU once it has fulfilled the necessary prerequisites. In our neighborhood, Hamas terrorist attack against Israel in October 2023 sparked a new round of hostilities in the Middle East. From the outset, we recognized Israel's right to self-defense while emphasizing the humanitarian aspect of this issue. We have long called for humanitarian relief and have provided assistance in terms of food and cash, highlighting the obligation to protect civilians and create humanitarian routes. I would like to commend the crucial importance of Cyprus's initiative to establish the Amalfi Maritime Corridor, contributing decisively to the delivery of humanitarian aid in Gaza. After 2 years of hostilities, we wish that the historic agreement reached between Israel and Hamas on the first phase of the US President Trump's Gaza peace plan can result in a lasting peace. We hope that this will finally lead to a comprehensive settlement and the launch of a political process aimed at a two-state solution based on relevant UN resolutions. When discussing security challenges, it is obvious that we must also focus on the new forms of threats emerging in the 21st century. Hybrid threats, including cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns, instrumentalization of migration by third countries, or interference in democratic elections constitute yet another growing menace to our security. In recent years, in one way or another, Europe has faced threats of this kind which seek to provoke feelings of insecurity. The protection of the rule of law, the strengthening of transparency, the safeguarding of democratic institutions must be our reliable compass in the face of any attempts at intimidation. The demonstration of solidarity among partners and the collective condemnation of such actions caused by third countries must be immediate and clear. As we face these complex and interlinked challenges, the Republic of Cyprus is called upon to assume the presidency of the European Union at a time when tectonic changes are taking place in Europe and the world. In my opinion, when speaking about diplomacy, one of the greatest challenges ahead of us is the crisis of multilateralism. Multilateralism, at its core, is the idea that global problems require global solutions. It is the spirit that built the European Union many years ago, as well as many other international and regional organizations that have helped maintain relative peace and progress since the end of the Second World War. However, in recent years, this spirit of multilateralism has begun to fade. We observe a worrying rise of unilateralism, increased geopolitical competition, and economic inequality. I believe that the concept of comprehensive security in this framework is more relevant than ever. I think that we should adopt a holistic approach that emphasizes the political, military, the economic, environmental, and the human dimension, reminding us that security is indivisible. None can be sustained without the others. It is evident that areas of tension surround Europe. It is time for further reflection then. These wider geopolitical developments have highlighted the need for Europe to assume greater responsibility for its defense within the framework of close Euro-Atlantic ties. For instance, Greece is one of those countries that for many years have maintained their defense spending at a level well above the European average. Strengthening the European Union's strategic autonomy while fully respecting the security and defense interests of all member states has emerged as one of the most important issues that will determine our common future. We must ensure that Europe remains not only a prosperous continent, but a geopolitical actor capable of shaping its own destiny. That means investing in security and defense, achieving technological leadership, reducing energy dependencies, and above all, reinforcing collective resilience. On the wider Eastern Mediterranean, Greece and Cyprus, located in a region of high geopolitical importance, are called upon to defend the southeastern borders of the European Union. As member states of this union, our two countries remain pillars of stability and security, promote good neighborly relations, defend international law. This constructive, I believe, approach is further confirmed by the developments of trilateral and many multilateral cooperation schemes established and developed in recent years with neighboring countries. Through these synergies, Greece and Cyprus have become bridges of prosperity and peace and have further highlighted their pivotal role as reliable and credible interlocutors. Nevertheless, vigilance against revisionist agendas, no matter their source, that seek to impose fait accompli in violation of international law must be constant. The Republic of Cyprus has been suffering from the open wound of the Turkish occupation for 51 years now, while Nicosia continues to be the only divided capital in Europe. I would once again like to stress that Greece stands by the side of the Republic of Cyprus for the fulfillment of the efforts made for the reunification of the island on the well-known basis of the bizonal bicommunal federation in accordance with all UN Security Council resolutions and the EU acquis. To conclude, the security challenges facing our European continent are constantly multiplying. The volatile geopolitical balance, combined with the emergence of new technologies, creates a different framework to which we must respond. Our continent has enjoyed decades of economic prosperity. European economic integration, our common currency, the protection of democratic institutions, human rights, and democratic elections, as well as the respect for international law, have been all this year the cornerstone of our cooperation. As we navigate uncharted waters today, I firmly believe that determination and solidarity are key to strengthening the European Union's footprint in order to secure its position as a global player, protecting the interests of the citizens and offering security and stability across the continent, our continent. Thank you very much.
I thank Ambassador Kollias for his statement. Mr. Svendsen, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, and thank you for having me on this panel, and also thank you for acknowledging at the start of the conference that NUPI is a co-sponsor of this. That might be why I've been given a seat around the table, but really the pleasure is on our side, and let's be honest, there is not going to be a PPC in Oslo anytime soon. So any contributions we can make, we are very happy to do that. And in addition, at least for myself, I've been thinking about our contribution to this conference, even though the financial streams are different. Maybe we can say it's funded by our surging natural gas income since 2022. So this session is called European Security Challenges. And speaking of that, in late 2025 means we can actually speak about almost everything. We're living in a new world, a world that is currently in limbo and characterized by massive uncertainty, as per the program of the meeting as well. It's times of interregnum. We know what we're leaving, but we are not fully aware of what will emerge. And liberal democracies are still struggling to save everything that can be saved from that old order. And in general, the European response to increased uncertainty is security. Security from Russia in the conventional and hybrid domains, digital security, food security, security of supply, secure access to critical raw materials, health security, preparation for the next major health crisis, economic security, security in space, and critical infrastructure security, to mention just a few. So almost everything in Europe is becoming securitized in the hope of providing stability for Europeans in this age of uncertainty. So to this end, we now have a geopolitical commission in Brussels, and the notion of strategic autonomy is becoming less of a debate and more of a reality that European nations must strive towards. I'm not going to spend time on Donald Trump during my 15 minutes, but I could have started right here. I will make my regards pertaining to what I would call, in terms of European security, the big one, and it's probably also a bit of a northern perspective, namely on the war in Ukraine and its implications for Europe. And I think the analysis of EU-level initiatives and European rearmament or readiness, there are two terms, you can choose which ones you want to use, should rest sort of on the analysis of the context. So first is the threat picture coming from Russia, and it was discussed in the Q&A in the previous session. There is the increasingly intensifying conflict that we're seeing with Europe's neighbor to the east. So European intelligence services report little to no shift in Russia's approach to victory in Ukraine, and the same intelligence services, albeit with some variation, are careful not to define the boundaries of Russian imperialism. And one of the reasons for this is that Russian imperialism today is not only territorial. Hybrid activity from Russia towards European states have been increasing since 2014, and its rise has been especially sharp since 2023. We all read about it: drone and airspace incursions, cyber attacks, and election interference, to mention a few. Now, there are different ways to deal with these types of threats, and coming from Norway and being given a microphone, I would like to give you a recent example from Norway, because I just attended a briefing of open source information from the Norwegian intelligence services, and they have come up with a new concept to address the increased hybrid Russian activity in Europe. And hold on to your hats. Hybrid peace is the new buzzword in the Norwegian intelligence service. I guess the aim seems to be to reassure the population of Norway that they should not make too much of these incidents, drones flying over airports and so forth, signaling that they do not mean that we are at any kind of war with Russia. That's an interesting case of rhetorics, as the securitization of Russian hybrid activity can mean different things. Clearly, the Norwegian armed forces are keen not to allow drones shutting down airports every once in a while to have escalatory effects. But it of course matters whether a hybrid activity from Russia is labeled hybrid peace or an act of hybrid warfare. And in many European capitals, Russian incursions and cyber attacks are not considered acts of hybrid peace, but of hybrid war. In any case, there is little to suggest that the rising tensions with Russia is about to decrease in intensity and scope. It should be, but it does not seem to be in the Russian interest either, which was also addressed in the previous Q&A. The second aspect is battleground dynamics and Ukrainian needs in the war against Russia. At the current moment, Ukraine is holding, but in the long term, Ukraine is losing the war. Currently, there is no front line in Ukraine. The battlefield has developed into a kill zone of approximately 30 kilometers, and the conditions are gruesome. Europe has provided a lot of equipment, much of it off the shelf, not always placing Ukrainian needs at the center, but rather what could be provided at any moment in time. And Ukraine has obviously and understandably gladly accepted everything on offer. Yet, all of it is not all that useful. For instance, it took some time for the Germans to allow Leopard battle tanks to be shipped to Ukraine. They were eventually shipped, but now many of those tanks are actually in storage because they're not particularly useful in the kill zone. We know that this is now a drone war. The rate of innovation is high. The claims are approximately 3 to 6 weeks. And currently, Russia is leading on fiber optic drones that have once again transformed modern warfare. And obviously, this brings serious dilemmas. The European approach has consistently been that Ukraine is the only state that can decide what counts as an acceptable outcome of the war, and Europe will stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes. And thus far, the Ukrainian government is not changing course. A full return to the pre-2014 borders is the only acceptable solution, not least a seat at the negotiating table. And here again, I could talk about the US president. We all know this, we follow this, so I will not go into that. And the EU is responding to the aforementioned. I'm also very aware of not conflating EU and Europe, being a Norwegian, so I try to keep using the correct terms. But the Union toolbox is expanding by the day. One is the SAFE mechanism, was mentioned earlier, to unlock funds for investing, preferably collaboratively, in defense. And these days it is the efforts pertain to the recent Preserving Peace Defense Readiness Roadmap to try to close critical capability gaps. So the 4 key initiatives here is the Eastern Flank Watch, European Drone Defense Initiative, European Air Shield, European Space Shield. And again, to reiterate Ian Bond's point, this is not only rhetorics, but it needs to move beyond rhetorics as well if it is to have an effect. So given the threats and the security situation and the European rhetoric about the war in Ukraine, the EU is not doing enough, even with these initiatives. But those that have followed EU defense for some time will know that this process is highly incremental. So what's next? Those are ongoing discussions, and I guess we all follow them in the news. One is to unlock frozen Russian assets and provide the reparations loan to Ukraine sooner rather than later. This is pivotal for Ukraine, and I think we very soon are going to see even more starkly the effects of US funds basically drying up. So this is, of course, on the radar. Second is to keep pushing for membership talks with Ukraine. I think Europe and European leaders cannot underestimate the value of membership negotiations with Ukraine, and that needs to be communicated to the public as well, I think. And in recent days and weeks, we've seen this an apparent Hungarian desire to set up a V3 blocking format. They don't call it that, but to join Slovakia and Czechia and sort of set up a V3 to cooperate on being difficult on Ukraine. That is, of course, demanding in terms of EU support for Ukraine. So it was mentioned already, reform agenda and qualified majority voting on more issues should not be an easy fix, but it's definitely important given the analysis of the security situation. But still, the most important element is to strengthen the industrial base and avoid duplication, and this is what the EU does best. And no other actor really can facilitate this as forcefully as the EU, and it is increasingly getting serious about it. But there is more to be done, and I think, here comes my advice, I think there can be done more at the EU level in order to see contributions to Ukraine as a contribution to Europe. Of course, we hear this in speeches, but there are some things that can be done, which has mutual benefits. So one is to invest more in the Ukrainian defense industry. So Ukraine's defense industry is running approximately on 30 to 40% of its total production capacity. Denmark, Norway, and the Netherlands are inside already and doing this. And there are mutual benefits to all by ramping up production in Ukraine, providing licensing agreements, and setting up joint ventures inside of Ukraine. And Ukraine will at some point become a core provider of stockpiles in Europe. So, and actually the discussion in Ukraine is already ongoing about lifting export restrictions. So if you can get enough produced in Ukraine, they can also lift export restrictions, which is a contribution to European rearmament. Another thing is to support more actively, and I'm not sure if it's even happening at any rate, non-governmental organizations in Ukraine that provide equipment directly to the brigades. They have proven immensely effective in this war. An example, and the biggest one, is the foundation Come Back Alive. They have vast impact with very limited funding, and they are arguably more transparent than the Ukrainian government itself. Third is to start learning from Ukraine. This must be seen in the context of the previous point. The war has dragged on for so long that we're now at a stage where European states not only can focus on gathering support for Ukraine, but also take lessons and adapt their own armed forces to the lessons from Ukraine. So you contribute to strengthening European defense while helping Ukraine. It seems obvious. It's also important to balance, and this is the Norway point, to balance EU initiatives and coalitions of the willing in support for Ukraine. So again, this conflation of EU, Europe. Europe is doing a lot. It's doing more, the EU, but it's not the only actor. So to be more clear and communicate, because that's also, we talk about legitimacy and public support for what the EU is doing also on Ukraine. To be clear about what is the EU doing and what are the member states doing and what are the coalitions of the willing doing and what is NATO doing. And I will end on one of the big questions, and that is the relationship between support for Ukraine and European rearmament on the one hand, and the surge of the European far right on the other. I think it's pivotal to see and realize the increasing appeal of the far right across the EU, also in connection with support to Ukraine. The cost-benefit analysis of increasing defense spending to counter threats and support Ukraine, the high politics of the state, if you wish, must find the right balance not to inflict too high costs on EU citizens, the low politics of the state. This is not easy. European support to Ukraine is gradually declining, especially among people who are economically insecure and people who use social media as their main news source. So we have heard mention already of social Europe today, and I think these two things need to be seen in concert much more. So the high costs of supporting Ukraine and the influx of Ukrainian refugees across Europe to some extent fuels the far right that argue money is better spent on one's own population. This concerns the boosting of investment in the defense sector, which is where the EU is taking the greatest leaps. It's crucial in order to provide security in Europe, but it also has a broader remit. So with massive investments in defense, the defense industry will become a crucial motor in European economy, including through producing jobs and leading technological development, which is something that is on the radar but seen in a different sort of policy field. But if Europeans are to support increasing defense spending and continued support to Ukraine, it needs also to contribute to social Europe, a Europe where people have opportunities and stable incomes and thus lives. The defense industry is said to be a cornerstone in this development. It's not the car industry anymore, it's the defense industry. But of course, the alternative to these processes is also associated with the far right, even authoritarian politics. For one, Russia's authoritarian model cannot win in Ukraine. And if Europe gives up on Ukraine, that war-torn society will have ample ground for a far-right resurgence, fueled by legitimate grievances over having been left behind by its partners that motivated it to fight for years. So I guess on this final point, I'm veering into normative turf, but this is essentially a question about saving liberal democracy. In the end, the necessary rearmament of Europe will only be legitimate and successful if it contributes to the provision of welfare and life equality to European citizens, no matter how cynical that sounds. At least it's politically pragmatic. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Svendsen for his statement. Mrs. Larsen.
Thank you.
You have the floor.
Thank you very much. I'm going to stand up because I have a PowerPoint presentation. So I have the questionable honor of giving the last presentation of the day. Thank you so much. Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My name is Jessica Larsen. I'm a senior researcher at the Danish Institute for International Studies, where I focus on maritime security, studying how my own country, Denmark, but also the EU and like-minded actors collaborate to counter threats at sea. So my presentation will reflect on the EU as a maritime security actor and where the current changing threat landscape leaves, in particular, the CSDP and the EU as a blue power. And I'll suggest at the end a spread of what I would call strategic puzzles that are worth looking at in the years to come if the EU is to consolidate as a blue power. Now, the maritime perspective is far from a niche. 70% of the Earth is covered by water. 90% almost of international trade is transported at sea. 99% of data, internet data, is transported through underwater cables. So there are many examples of why we need maritime security, and the EU has economic, political, cultural, and security interest in peaceful and sustainable use of the oceans. We need the freedom of navigation, this important and foundational principle in the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. Now, before I start speaking about the European security challenges, which is the title of the panel, and looking at this from a maritime perspective, I just want to spend a couple of minutes on maritime CSDP missions to get acquainted with how the EU sees and addresses security threats at sea. On a strategic and operational level, the EU has come out in recent decades as a maritime security provider that has the political ambition to be a blue power. And we see this in all the initiatives that are coming out of Brussels, a proliferation of documents and policies and tools and operations and external action. As part of the EU's external action, the CSDP has now for 2 decades used a CivMil toolbox to deal with crisis management, support peace and stabilization, undertake capacity building, promote international law and multilateralism. Of the CSDP's 20 active missions, I have listed here the ones with maritime implications. So of 12 active civilian missions, there are 2 with maritime implications, EUBAM Libya and EUCAP Somalia. And of 8 military missions, there are 4 with maritime implications, EUMAM Mozambique, EUTM Somalia, IRINI in the Mediterranean, and EUNAVFOR Aspides in the Red Sea. These missions show the breadth, firstly in the EU's security definition, which obviously goes way beyond military threats. It secondly shows the breadth of the CSDP toolbox. So there's border management, there's capacity building, there's law enforcement, there's military assistance, there's training missions, and a military operation in the Red Sea. So this is the comprehensive approach in action, the EU's trademark that defines the EU as a security actor. So zooming out for a moment, looking at sort of the historical military CSDP missions, it started with traditional peacekeeping and preventing humanitarian disasters, for instance in the Balkans and Congo. Then came more geostrategic considerations with Atalanta protecting European trade routes from piracy, then Sophia and IRINI moving closer to home, addressing sort of internal security threats within the EU. So we see a maturation of the EU as a security actor reflected in the shifts of CSDP military deployments. And with all the policy initiatives happening in Brussels on security and defense, especially since the 2016 global strategy, the EU is stepping up to become a provider also of harder security than the initial security development nexus applied at the outset with peacekeeping and humanitarian aid. And I think Aspides in the Red Sea is a really apt case of harder security countering the Houthis in the Red Sea. The picture is arguably a little bit less clear with civilian CSDP missions. We have here a list of ongoing missions, and in terms of geography and mandates, I think it's more of a mix, which again speaks to the EU as a broad security actor. So the EU's ability to tailor CSDP interventions to what is needed and combining civilian and military policies relevant to each specific theater is a strength of the CSDP. Research shows that the civilian-military combination attaches legitimacy to the EU as a security provider. For instance, in the maritime domain, Norway opted to collaborate with Atalanta on counter-piracy rather than joining NATO, rather than joining the US-led combined maritime forces. And this was not least due to the fact that the EU had a civilian component, which was EUCAP Nestor at the time. So the CivMil toolbox is a pull factor. So that was a bit about the EU as a security and a maritime security provider. The process of establishing a security identity for the EU is many decades old, but with the Petersburg talks and the St. Malo Declaration in 1998, well, that gave birth to the CSDP, and the EAS was established in 2009, and of course the rest is history. But I mention these highlights because they remind us of the fact that the CSDP was developed in the post-war period, when the Western world was setting the agenda in international politics with liberal democracy as sort of the global goal, and secondly was reaping the benefits of the peace dividend. The EU's crisis management toolbox was a perfect match for both the EU's identity as a peace project and the nature of security challenges at the time, with peacekeeping, capacity building, training missions, and so on. And of course, we know, reading papers and just being alive, we know this is all changing. Geographically, again, from a maritime perspective, sea lanes of strategic relevance to European supply chains and security face challenges across the globe. But also Europeans' own waters are increasingly becoming critical theaters of geopolitical competition and hybrid threats. And we all know it, I don't have to go through them. The Arctic, the Baltic, the North Sea, jamming, spoofing, cable cuts, mystical drones, shadow fleets, and so on. All these hybrid threats that we've been discussing today, not least. The new hybrid threats show us how threats are hardening at sea. So 15 years ago, we were speaking about Somali piracy, which is a crime, and it's a really bad crime, but all things equal, it is only a crime. Now we have non-state actors firing missiles at merchant vessels. We have state actors disrupting sea lanes in the Strait of Hormuz, state actors harassing fishing fleets in the South China Sea, and so on. We face a more severe type of threat. It's not becoming more insecure, but the threats are hardening. Also, from a legal perspective, hybrid threats are a mess. Is it international humanitarian law or is it law of the sea, peacetime law, when we choose a framework and define responses? Perpetrators can be difficult to conclusively ascertain in cases of hybrid attacks, so attribution becomes a headache. If it's a state that is the author of a hybrid attack, it's more complicated than countering sort of more simple crime like piracy. The changing security threats that we all know spark questions about how the CSDP can remain a preferred and relevant instrument to fit these current realities. So this is where we turn to the strategic dilemmas. So I'm going to illustrate these strategic dilemmas as a continua or opposite poles, but I don't think it's a matter of choosing between either or, both and, or finding some place in the middle. It's more of a thinking tool to think about how the EU can better sit in the world. And these dilemmas or the poles even overlap slightly, but they come with different angles. So the first one is crisis management and hybrid threats. I'm just going through a couple, but I'm sure we can find many more. So strategically, the EU is addressing hybrid threats more, especially since the Global Compact. But operationally, the CSDP maritime missions are about maritime law enforcement, training, capacity building, and primarily countering crime and migration, and it's all taking place outside of Europe. So question, should that balance change so that operations follow strategy? How can the EU adapt its policies to better respond to hybrid threats at sea, and should it? I already mentioned that hybrid threats sit in the gray zone between war and peace and raise questions about international law that make it difficult for states to respond. Of course, the EU at this point also maintains NATO as its primary security guarantee, and that leads to another continua or puzzle, European territory versus external action. So CSDP's geographical scope is outside the EU, as per Article 42.1 of the Treaty of the European Union, and NATO guarantees our territorial defense. But looking at external action, should the EU actually do more, for example, in the Indo-Pacific region? Again, I'm coming from a maritime perspective, but it also is about land. The EU signed new security and defense partnerships with Korea and Japan in November last year. Inside the EU, can tools from the CSDP toolbox add value to security operations within the EU, and how would we do with the risk of overlapping competencies, clashes with justice and home affairs and NATO, and so on. The next one, CivMil versus collective defense. The strategic compass reaffirmed the importance of hard power as an integral part of the Union's foreign security and defense policy, as did the global strategy before that. And now we also have PESCO, EDF, CARD, the military planning and conduct capability, the European Peace Facility, and you can continue the list. So the future of EU crisis management under the CSDP will likely have more military implications, not fewer. At the same time, geopolitics and transatlantic challenges are spilling into NATO security guarantee and pushing the EU in the same direction of more defense cooperation. But should the EU, I don't have a particular stance on this, I'm just being devil's advocate, should the EU move towards a defense organization? And this question is, of course, not new, it's ongoing and it goes beyond the CSDP, obviously. But what I want to say here is two things about the CSDP. The EU is a broad security provider and therefore historically a legitimate security provider and a preferred partner, as I spoke about in the case of Atalanta. There are other examples as well. Thinking about developing the CSDP, there is a balancing act in how to remain true to the EU's broader identity as a regional organization with important political and economic objectives beyond security and military dimensions, as we have been speaking about today as well, the social EU. Also, secondly, the value of the CSDP is the comprehensive approach, combining civilian and military policies and diplomacy as well. Most countries are increasing their spending on defense these years for obvious reasons, but in the frame of the CSDP, there is a question about how to ensure sufficient funding for the civilian component of the CSDP in the next MFF. Then there's member states, Brussels, where to place power and competencies. The EU military operations often depend on national assets and voluntary contributions, unlike a standing army. Military CSDP requires unanimity in the Council. We've spoken about this, which can be blocked by member states. And one of the challenges of EU NAVFOR, countering piracy off the coast of Somalia, is lacking force generation. And I think Sofia faced the same problem. Are we looking then at strengthening the military planning and conduct capability? Can we do more with the coordinated maritime presences, although there are challenges coming to agreement on areas of interest? And then the last one is multilateralism and strategic autonomy. So how multilateral should we be? An analysis of CSDP military missions and operations to date show that a UN mandate is, or a request to act is a de facto conditioning or condition for CSDP missions. The same type of wording can be found in the Treaty of the European Union, the Global Strategy, the Strategic Compass, the wording that is very cordial in linking the EU to broader goals of the UN and also the complementarity to NATO. So should the EU abandon this niceness? Conditioning the CSDP on the UN Security Council may hamper greater European strategic autonomy because it gives non-EU states veto power over EU military deployments. But it has its benefits too, because member states have different strategic cultures and because of the unanimity requirement in CSDP decision-making, where a UN mandate can smooth things. So finally, taking a step back, the EU is facing a changed threat landscape at sea as well as on land, at home, as well as abroad. Threats that include not only crime, but also hybrid threats and geopolitical competition, and even global power balances and doubts about the transatlantic security guarantee. So how the EU responds and with which tools is an open question, and one that I think that we need to engage with in the months and years to come. So thank you for your attention.
I thank Mrs. Larsen for her statement. Andreas, we have time to take questions.
Yes. We finish, we started at,
Right on time, huh?
yes, and we will finish right on time. So I think we have a few minutes.
How many can we take? How many questions?
Let's see the minutes. We started at 4 o'clock.
Mm-hmm.
So we have 14 minutes until 5 o'clock.
So that gives us about time for about, what, 5 questions?
It's up to you. You chair. In this, I would like to ask a question. I didn't raise my hand to chair.
Please.
Yes, I mean,
You do the honors, please.
I have read carefully, and I will not. I will start with my Norwegian colleague. Okay, I heard about the European security threats coming from Russia, do you think that Europe faces similar security threats from Turkey? And would you support a similar policy towards Turkey, similar to the one against Russia, given that Turkey is also an aggression and holding almost 40% of the territory of a member state? And of course, the other two panelists can answer or comment if they wish.
I would say first that, and this is a difficult exercise, but my definition of that threat from Russia and the analysis of that is, of course, based also on what the politicians are saying. I'm a researcher, and what I'm saying is that the perception of that security threat from Russia is not going anywhere. So, of course, I'm chickening out a little bit on that one, but
Cypriots consider Turkey as security.
yes. So,
Being honest with you, my guess.
yes. I understand your question. I don't think I have a good answer because I haven't approached that question in that sense before. And I think you made your point by me not being able to give you a good reply to the question.
Any one of you two like to respond?
No comments, thanks.
Okay, all right. Yes, the gentleman behind Andreas, please.
Thank you very much. It's probably slightly unfair of me to ask a question when I was on the panel before and could have answered my own question. But I wondered, it didn't seem to me that any of the panelists said a lot about where China fits into this picture. And yet it fits in a variety of places. I mean, it fits in on the maritime security side because of the choke points that are off China's coasts. It fits in other ways because of its control of rare earth elements and therefore of our sort of supply chains in many ways. So what exactly is the challenge from China and how should Europe deal with it?
Because it's slightly related. I had a question about the Russian and the Chinese shadow fleets, and whether you think that this is objectively difficult to trace and track and hold them accountable, or whether this is yet another point in case of the EU's self-inflicted limitation. Thank you. Shall I ask or? Okay.
Please.
Thank you very much. I have a very short question. There's a lot of questions that were raised now where I'm thinking, will it maybe help, but I don't know, if we had an updated security strategy for the European Union, because we have a global compass. And I wonder, because you have the great expertise here, whether you think that would help address some of these issues. Or whether that would create more problems or yet another paper tiger. And I'm also mentioning it because the multi-annual financial framework, I mean, I'm not sure if the Commission gets away with it, but, the way that the planning looks is also that it takes away, much more oversight from the member states as to how the annual budget will be spent by making it more flexible. And that also makes all sorts of spending, on security-related matters, of course, that are in that budget. I think also, more, questionable what strategy it is. And we have a proliferation of shields, of, security initiatives by the Commission. We have, the Alliance of the Willing and so on and so forth, but no broad strategy. So what is everybody doing, and are we doing different things? And not to mention that we have so many member states with many different threat perceptions and et cetera, et cetera. So I would be curious to hear from you. Do we need an updated security strategy, or maybe better not? Thank you.
Good evening from me as well. My question will be focused on Ms. Jessica about what she said for the European Union's mostly maritime actions, because the European Union has member states of the European Union, better said, have territories outside of Europe. For example, the French Republic possesses territories in almost every continent. and mainly on the Oceania, which controls French Polynesia, which is one of the main strategic targets for the People's Republic of China to influence, or the Kingdom of Denmark, which also has in North America and the Caribbean some outer territories. Does the European Union plan on sending maritime security on those regions, or does it focus mainly on the continent and the surrounding seas around it? Or even if the member states themselves are not willing to accept any further support from other member states, or if they're completely independent from it?
I think that should be the last one.
Okay. I just wanted to throw a different aspect into the debate and picking up on the securitization dimension. I really liked, the way you pointed that out. But also, knowing that in Germany now, the chancellor is very clear on that external security equals internal security, and internal security equals external security. And of course, he's mentioning that with an eye on the migration policy. And since at the opening of this conference, we also heard that, of course, migration policy is a key priority of the Cyprus presidency. I was wondering in how far, you see that as also the migration policy in terms of related to the European security challenges title. I mean, all of you on the panel, basically.
Okay. We should give the opportunity to our panelists to reply to there have been 5 questions, right? So,
No, please.
you do the honors.
Yes, so many questions. I'll address a couple. China. I didn't prepare for China in my notes, so thanks for bringing it up. I think the problem, of course, on the issue I was talking about, Russia, China is an issue. And then you bring in Chinese support and the equipment that they provide to Russia, and their strategic sort of increasing partnership is an issue for Europe. And then if we think about this in terms of Europe's role in the world, which was discussed in the previous panel, I thought EU doesn't want to close the world entirely, but we heard, and especially, it's not fair because the French ambassador left, but talking about the EU as a global power, she mostly talked about some sort of gradual closing of Europe. And that's, of course, a development that's taking place against international developments, not only in Russia, but also with regards to China. So I think the problem is you want to keep as much stuff open as possible. And when it comes to rare earth minerals, which I'm not an expert in, but I learned that many of them actually that we call rare earth minerals aren't all that rare. So we actually, if we just coordinate better among ourselves, many of them can be replaced. But at the same time, you need that trade for the unforeseeable future. So you want to keep that open as well. And I think in terms of my initial comments about everything being securitized, I think it's a normative idea not to securitize absolutely everything. So you need to have some kind of you need to have open strategic autonomy, right? Which is the concept really. And yeah, that on China, I think also would like to respond to the migration question. I think that's really, really difficult, and it's more because me as a citizen is becoming more and more concerned about the far right, and I see the emergence of the far right across many policy fields. And not to open a new discussion, but of course that is also partly a result of the political class failure to address people's concerns. So Europe's challenge in terms of Ukraine and all the security challenges to sort of to tie that together with migration policy is to provide a European society in which the forces that ask for repatriation gain too much speed, which is they're currently on track. So obviously that needs to be managed. I was listening interestingly to the discussions earlier also about migration, and obviously that being one of Cyprus's priorities. I think Europe, based on its core values, needs to think very deeply about how to manage migration to avoid it becoming securitized to a larger extent than it is, but not what's the word, turning into some kind of xenophobic actor on the issue of migration. Thank you.
Yeah, please.
Well, thank you so much for all these questions. China looms large everywhere. We just heard Trump say that he was going to start testing nuclear weapons, so maybe he can deal with it. No, bad joke. I mean, the South China Sea, Taiwan Strait, from a maritime perspective, these are, of course, all problems that the EU needs to think about. The coordinated maritime presence is a concept outside of the CSDP that has been discussed in the context of the Indo-Pacific region. Where that discussion is now, I don't know. But I think the strategic puzzles that I listed, and there are more of them, speaks exactly to the point that the EU has not found a chair to sit on yet. Is it a defense union or is it not? Or is the EU bound to its trade policy with China, not least, or not? So that, I think, is a political question, and one that I won't go further into, but just to say that the EU has definitely not decided where it sits yet. On whether the EU should update its security strategy, I mean, there are so many policies and strategies, and yes, of course, an update can be useful. You mentioned the word paper tiger. That was also what came to my mind. I think what we need at this point is to act. I don't have a particular position on whether the strategy should be updated, but is it the strategic compass that's from 2022? I'm losing track now. Yeah, but not very old. So, and it's being, I mean, things are being implemented, but more, of course, needs to be done on that one. Yeah, the shadow fleet is a damned issue in terms of international law. There is so little that states can do because of the freedom of navigation. And this is such a foundational principle in international law, and it's very hard to get around it. And the NATO summit in January this year established a working group with all the Nordic and Baltic states, legal experts from the ministries of foreign affairs, and they are discussing what to do, whether we can see the shadow fleet and cable cuts as a form of piracy, because piracy is defined well in the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which I don't think is, I don't think that interpretations will go that way. Port states and coastal states can do certain things in the territorial waters, or if a shadow fleet goes into port. But if they don't, there's nothing really to do unless there is an oil spill or some other blatant breach. Otherwise, the flag state looms large, and this is why the shadow fleet and cable cuts are just happening with impunity. And for Denmark, for instance, as a shipping nation, we are not inclined to have a dynamic interpretation of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, because if our ships, Maersk, are in the Taiwan Strait or in the South China Sea, and China says, "Oh, we're just making up this this bad thing that the Danish ship did," then, I mean, it creates precedents. And I think at this point we really need to be careful not to go down that road. So that's very frustrating, but that's the nature of international law. And then on the outer regions and the EU's territories, overseas territories, Denmark doesn't have territory in the Caribbean anymore, but Greenland for sure. Yeah, I mean, again, the coordinated maritime presences would be one way for the EU to be present further away in a national capacity, but with an EU flag, so it's outside of the CSDP. There are, of course, different strategic cultures. I was talking about it myself, but someone also mentioned the fact that there are different threat perceptions and force flow issues in maritime missions. Some missions are missions more in name than in practice, because there are no ships to them. So this is a huge issue, and this is why the CMP, the Coordinated Maritime Presence, could be one tool to act where it's in a national capacity. So France could, for instance, flag the EU flag, but still be under national command to kind of spread the few assets that we do have abroad. But of course, at this point, we're looking more at using our military capabilities closer to home because of the security situation in Europe. But it's not permanent. I just want to end on that note, actually. In May, we had TEPSA in Copenhagen. My institution hosted it. In the same month, I was invited onto a German warship that was docked in Copenhagen Harbor, and I had a tour. And it was part of the Operation Baltic Sentry, the NATO mission in the Baltic Sea. And then a couple of days later, I lit a candle in the window, as we always do in the beginning of May, to celebrate freedom, the freedom from German occupation during the Second World War. It was the 80th anniversary this year. And the contrast of being on a friendly warship and then celebrating freedom, like 80 years ago, no one would have thought that I could visit a German warship. 20 years ago, we were collaborating in a formal way, NATO and Russia. And now, not so much. But just to say, politics change, history changes, and hopefully this situation that we're in now will also change. Maybe not in 10 years, but hopefully in 11 years.
Well, great questions with no answers, I'm afraid. Well, I'm not an expert. The only thing I would like to say is that we really navigate in very rough seas, I'm afraid, but I'm always optimistic, you know. And I really believe in EU strength. And I think that we will finally manage it. We have, well, Ukraine is really a turning point in our history. So we first have to find a solution, to reach an agreement, a ceasefire agreement, and then look into all other issues pending ahead. But I'm always optimistic that we will manage it at the end of the day. So thank you.
Well, on my part, I should like to thank all three speakers, Andreas personally, and all of you. And now I consider my duty to declare plenary session number 3 over. And down with it.